All right, welcome to another Deep Dives. Today we're tackling a listener submission, uh, the 2024 State of Agricultural Commodity Markets Report.
From the FAO.
Yes, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN.
Yep.
So it's a big one. We're going to try to tease out how global food trade impacts nutrition.
It's a really fascinating report, actually.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
where do we even begin?
Well, I think one of the most interesting places to start is with this idea of the nutrition transition.
Okay.
As countries develop economically, their diets change in pretty predictable ways.
Yeah, that makes sense, right? Like if you're just trying to get by, you're probably not eating, super healthy.
Right, you're going to eat whatever's cheapest and most filling.
Yeah, exactly.
So, diets in those situations rely heavily on staple foods, cereals, root vegetables.
Uh-huh.
But as incomes rise, economies grow, people have more disposable income, their diets start to diversify.
Then they start branching out a little more, maybe getting some of the things they always wanted but couldn't afford.
Exactly. We see a shift towards animal products, more fats, more processed foods. And this is all accelerated by, globalization and urbanization and just technological advancements.
Yeah, right.
Suddenly you have supermarkets overflowing with choices, food processing techniques that make it possible to ship foods all over the world.
It's like the whole world is your pantry now.
Yeah, it really is. And the report highlights the case of Mexico as a really, clear example of this transition. Between 1980 and 2018, Mexico experienced this huge amount of economic growth, and during that same period, their per capita cereal consumption plummeted by over 40%.
Wow.
But at the same time, their consumption of sugary drinks skyrocketed by 164%.
Oh, wow. So, yeah, more money doesn't necessarily mean healthier eating.
It's not a direct correlation. It's a very complicated equation, and this kind of raises an interesting question. As your life circumstances change, maybe you get a promotion, move to a new city, start a family. How do your own dietary choices shift?
That's right. Do you reach for that extra piece of fruit?
Or do you go for that convenient processed snack?
Yeah. Interesting. The report also talks about how trade directly impacts the variety of foods we have access to and the nutrients that come with that variety.
And the impact is huge. In 2020 alone, trade actually doubled the average diversity of foods available for consumption globally. So that means people have access to a way wider range of foods than they would if they only ate what was produced locally.
Right. So instead of just, apples and pears, you might have mangoes and papayas and dragon fruit, like all sorts of things. But does this greater variety actually lead to better nutrition?
There's a lot of evidence to suggest that it does. Take micronutrients, for example, the vitamins and minerals that are essential for good health but can be scarce in certain regions. The report found that between 2010 and 2020, the average global supply of these essential micronutrients actually increased. And this increase was even more pronounced in countries that were more open to trade.
Wow. So by opening up to global trade, countries can actually fill in those nutritional gaps and make sure their people have access to a wider range of those essential nutrients.
Yeah.
That's incredible. But there have to be some downsides, right?
You're right to be skeptical. Trade can be a powerful tool for good when it comes to nutrition, but it's not a perfect solution. One of the things that the report highlights is that nutrient-dense foods, the ones that are packed with vitamins and minerals and fiber,
The good stuff.
yeah, the good stuff, they're often the most expensive in the global market.
Oh, really? So the foods that are best for us are also the priciest. Why is that?
Well, it's a few factors. Production costs tend to be higher for those foods. Think about fresh produce. It requires more careful handling, more specialized storage. And then there's perishability. A lot of nutrient-dense foods have a short shelf life, which increases the risk of spoilage during shipping.
Oh, I see.
So that all gets factored into the price.
But wouldn't you think demand would be high enough to drive the price down? I mean, everybody wants healthy food, right?
You'd think so, but consumer preferences are really complex. They can be influenced by culture, by taste, and by, marketing.
Right.
And sometimes misleading marketing. And this kind of lower demand for nutrient-dense foods can make them less competitive compared to those cheaper options.
Right. The stuff that's, maybe not as good for us, but it's more readily available and more affordable.
Exactly. And the FAO even found that tariffs, those taxes on imported goods, can impact food prices.
Yeah.
And it actually applies equally to both nutritious and less healthy options.
So even if trade brings in a wider variety of foods, those healthier options might still be out of reach for a lot of people just because of the cost.
It's a dilemma.
It's a real dilemma, isn't it?
It is. And it becomes even more apparent when we consider the role of trade in the global obesity epidemic.
Oh, yeah, right. Trade can bring us those exotic fruits from afar,
Yeah.
but it also makes it easier to get our hands on all those processed goodies that are packed with sugar, fat, and salt.
Yeah, trade can increase our access to healthy options, but it also opens the door to those less healthy processed foods. And as incomes rise in developing countries, we often see the surge in demand for processed foods that actually outpaces the demand for unprocessed options.
Wow, it's like a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
Trade can improve nutrition by making a wider variety of foods available, but it also makes it easier to access those less healthy processed foods that can contribute to all sorts of health problems.
Yeah.
It really makes you think, how has your own consumption of processed foods changed over time? Have you made a conscious effort to limit them?
Yeah. And this brings us to maybe a bit of a shocking statistic from the report. In Oceania, ultra-processed foods now make up 23% of all food imports by calories.
23%. That's almost a quarter of their imported food coming from ultra-processed sources.
It's a significant number.
That's a lot. So, how do we even begin to navigate this landscape? How do we make sure that trade promotes healthy diets rather than contributing to these, negative health trends? That's something we'll definitely want to discuss further.
So far, we've been mostly talking about how trade impacts individuals.
Right, their choices at the grocery store.
Like what ends up in their shopping cart. But the report kind of zooms out too and looks at how trade shapes entire landscapes.
The whole food system of countries.
Yeah, for like a whole region or a country. So what happens when we take that wider view? What's the role of trade then?
One of the most important roles is balancing food supply and demand on that global level.
Like moving food from where there's a lot of it to places where there's not enough.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, regions with really good harvests, they can share that with regions facing shortages.
And that helps to keep prices stable.
Right, and prevent those food shortages.
Okay, so that's on like the filling bellies side of things. But how does this affect nutrition? Well, when countries can import foods that maybe they just can't grow very well themselves, it increases the overall calorie availability.
Oh, so it's not just quantity. It's about the types of foods and the nutrients that come with them.
Yeah, it helps ensure people have access to what they need to really thrive.
And it can help lower prices, too.
Exactly. Makes things more affordable, especially for lower income households.
So trade can be a real game changer for addressing those nutritional needs.
Especially during a crisis.
Oh, like if a country gets hit by a natural disaster.
And their crops get wiped out.
Yeah, that's devastating. What happens to their food then?
That's when trade becomes essential. They can rely on imports to keep things going.
To prevent widespread hunger.
Right. And that ties into the concept of food security, which the report talks a lot about.
Food security. So what exactly does that mean?
Well, the FAO defines it as when everyone at all times has access to enough safe and nutritious food.
Not just any food, but the right kind of food.
Yeah, that meets their dietary needs and preferences so they can live a healthy and active life.
Okay, so trade is super important for that, especially with the global population growing.
And with climate change, making food production even more unpredictable.
Definitely. Now, we talked before about food variety for individuals, but how does that work on a national level?
The report uses these things called food diversity indicators.
Okay.
And it measures how many different types of food are actually available in a country.
So the more diverse a country's food supply is,
The better the chances of people getting all those different nutrients.
makes sense. So how does trade fit into that?
Well, by importing a variety of foods, countries can boost those diversity scores.
So give me an example. How does that actually work?
Well, imagine a country that only produces food domestically.
So their options are limited to what they can grow themselves.
Exactly. Their climate, their soil, all those factors play a role.
So they might only be able to grow certain types of crops.
Right. But when they open up to trade, it's like a whole world of possibilities.
They could import things that wouldn't grow in their own country.
Exactly. Fruits and vegetables from tropical areas, grains from temperate zones, even spices from far away.
It's like adding all these colors to their diet.
Yeah. And what the FAO found is that countries with more food diversity, driven by trade, tend to have better overall nutrition.
So a diverse food supply really equals a healthier population.
It seems that way. And remember that point we made about nutrient gaps?
Some regions just lack those essential vitamins and minerals.
The micronutrients? Well, trade can really help with that.
By bringing in foods that are rich in those specific nutrients.
Exactly. Between 2010 and 2020, the average supply of essential micronutrients actually increased globally.
Wow.
And that improvement was even more significant in countries that were actively trading food.
So it helps to level the playing field in terms of nutrient availability.
Exactly. No matter where a country is, they can access those important nutrients.
That's amazing. But we can't forget about the cost.
You're right. We've touched on it before, but it's really important.
The nutrient-dense foods,
Packed with vitamins, minerals, fiber,
the best stuff.
often come with a higher price tag on the global market.
It's frustrating that the foods that are best for us can also be the hardest to afford.
It is. And the report breaks down the reasons why.
Like, what are some of the key factors?
Well, production costs, first of all.
Yeah.
Think about fresh fruits and veggies. They require more careful handling, specialized storage.
You can't just throw them in a truck and ship them across the world.
Right, they need special conditions to maintain their quality.
And then there's perishability.
That ticking clock of freshness.
Exactly. Some foods just don't last that long.
So there's more risk of them going bad during transport, which makes them more expensive.
And we can't forget about demand.
Right. What people want to buy plays a huge role.
It's more than just cost, it's also those cultural preferences and taste.
And marketing, which can be misleading.
It's hard to resist those flashy ads for unhealthy snacks.
It is. And that lower demand for the good stuff makes those nutrient-dense foods less competitive.
Compared to the cheaper, more readily available options.
Unfortunately, yes. And to make matters even more complicated, tariffs, those taxes on imports, don't discriminate.
They apply to all foods equally.
So even if trade brings in more variety,
Those healthy options might still be out of reach for people.
it's really a multifaceted issue, and it highlights the need for solutions that go beyond just increasing trade. We need to look at making healthy foods more affordable.
And accessible to everyone.
Exactly.
So where do governments fit into all of this? Do they have a responsibility to address the nutritional challenges?
Absolutely, and that's where the idea of policy coherence comes in.
Okay, remind us what policy coherence is all about.
It's about acknowledging that trade policies and nutrition goals are super interconnected.
And that governments have to make sure they work together.
Right, not against each other.
So it's a more holistic approach, recognizing that decisions about trade can affect public health.
Exactly, and there are lots of strategies and policy tools to make that happen.
So give us some examples. How can governments actually promote healthier diets while still keeping trade in mind?
Well, one effective tool is something called excise taxes.
Okay.
These are taxes on unhealthy foods, like those soda taxes we talked about earlier.
Right, they make those less healthy options more expensive.
Exactly. And they can be used for both domestic and imported goods.
It's not about banning things, it's about nudging people toward better choices.
And the money raised from these taxes,
It can then be used to support healthy eating programs.
exactly, you can turn a negative into a positive.
I like that. So what else can governments do?
Well, nutrition labeling is another powerful tool.
Those labels on food packages that break down the nutritional content.
Exactly. They give consumers the information they need to make informed choices.
I've definitely noticed those labels getting more prominent and easier to understand.
And that transparency is key. It helps people make healthier choices.
And it might even encourage food companies to make their products healthier.
Right. They want to appeal to those informed consumers.
So labeling can really drive some positive change.
It can. And then there's the idea of repurposing agricultural subsidies.
Oh yeah, we touched on that earlier.
Instead of subsidizing those staple crops, why not support more nutrient-rich foods?
So farmers would have an incentive to grow more fruits, vegetables, things like that.
Exactly. It can make a huge difference in terms of both cost and availability.
And it would align agricultural policies more closely with nutrition goals. So governments can really help make those healthy foods more appealing.
For both producers and consumers.
And all of this requires collaboration.
Between the trade folks and the health folks.
We need to work together.
To create a system that supports both economic growth and well-being.
So it's about finding that sweet spot where trade promotes healthier diets around the world.
Absolutely. And the report highlights some great examples of countries that are already doing this.
Oh, really? I'd love to hear about some of those success stories.
Yeah.
Which countries are leading the way?
Well, Samoa is a great example.
Right.
They got a lot of attention a few years ago when they banned imported turkey tails.
Turkey tails, what are those?
It's a fatty, inexpensive cut of meat that became really popular in Samoa,
Oh.
but it was contributing to a lot of health problems.
So they banned them to protect public health.
Exactly, but they didn't stop there. They knew a total ban would have economic impacts.
So they switched to a tax instead.
An excise tax and import tariffs.
So they found a balance that addressed the health concerns while still allowing some trade.
It was a really smart approach.
A great example of policy coherence in action.
Absolutely. Another good example is Indonesia's Healthier Choice logo program.
Remind me, what was that again?
It's a labeling system where food companies can display a special logo.
If their products meet certain nutritional standards.
Right. It helps consumers easily identify the healthier options.
I like that idea.
It's been good for both consumers and businesses.
Consumers can make informed choices. Companies that meet the standards get more sales.
It incentivizes healthier production.
Those are really encouraging examples.
And there are plenty more out there. Countries are getting creative with their policies.
It's great to see some progress, but it can't be easy to achieve all of this on a global scale. What are some of the challenges?
Well, it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Right.
Each country has its own unique context.
Like their economic situation, their existing trade deals.
Even their cultural norms around food.
So what works in one place might not work in another.
Exactly. And there are often competing priorities to consider.
Like balancing economic growth with nutritional goals.
Some countries might depend heavily on exporting foods that aren't that healthy.
So it's a delicate balancing act.
It is. You need strong political will, clear communication between agencies, and long-term planning.
It's about more than just implementing a few policies.
It's a whole system shift.
A new way of thinking about trade and nutrition.
And that brings us to the role of international organizations.
Okay, how do they fit in?
Groups like the FAO and the World Health Organization are super important for providing guidance.
Like helping countries figure out how to align their policies.
Exactly. They do research, they publish reports like this one, and they offer support to countries trying to make changes.
They sound like really valuable resources.
They are, and their involvement is key to making this more widespread.
Not just isolated examples, but a global approach.
Exactly.
Well, this has been a really insightful look at the relationship between trade and nutrition.
It's fascinating how interconnected everything is.
Our food choices are tied to this global system.
A system that can both nourish and harm us.
That's for sure. But with careful planning, collaboration, and that policy coherence we talked about.
We can really use trade to create a healthier food future for everyone.
A great point to end on. But before we wrap up, there's one thing from the report that really stood out to me.
Oh, what was that?
The part about the globalization of dietary patterns.
Ah, yes. The convergence of food cultures.
Exactly. As economies grow and trade expands, we see this trend toward more homogeneous diets around the world.
It's interesting, right? We're moving away from those traditional local diets.
Toward a more standardized Western way of eating.
Like you can find McDonald's and Coca-Cola pretty much everywhere now.
A perfect example of how trade can homogenize cultures, at least when it comes to food.
It is.
But what does this mean for us? Is it a good thing, a bad thing?
It's complicated. There are both benefits and drawbacks to consider.
Okay, well, let's unpack it. What are some of the potential benefits of this globalization of diets?
Well, one major benefit is that nutritious foods are becoming available in places where they were scarce before.
Like we were talking about earlier, trade can fill those nutrient gaps.
Exactly. When countries open up to trade, they gain access to a whole range of foods.
Fruits, vegetables, things they might not be able to grow themselves.
Right. It gives people a chance to try new flavors and add variety to their diets.
And it can also help to connect different cultures through food.
That's a great point. Food is a powerful way to learn about other parts of the world.
But what about the downsides? What are some of the negative impacts of this dietary convergence?
Well, one concern is the potential loss of traditional food cultures.
Those unique, time-honored ways of eating that have been passed down for generations.
Exactly. As globalized diets become more common, those traditional practices might disappear.
Along with the cultural knowledge and values that go with them.
Right. It's like everything starts to taste the same.
And lose its unique character.
So it's important to find ways to preserve those traditional foodways.
Not just for their cultural significance,
but also for the nutritional benefits they might offer.
Those diets often evolved based on local conditions.
They could hold valuable insights into healthy and sustainable ways of eating.
That's a good point. And then there's the issue of the nutritional quality of these globalized diets.
Right, we know trade can bring in both healthy and unhealthy foods.
And those westernized diets tend to be higher in processed foods, fats, sugars, and salt.
The stuff that contributes to health problems.
So it's a double-edged sword, like we were saying before.
It is, and it highlights the need for a balanced approach to trade and nutrition.
Recognizing both the good and the bad.
Finding that middle ground is key.
And that requires thoughtful policies, consumer awareness, and a real appreciation for the diversity of food cultures.
Exactly.
Wow, this has been a really eye-opening deep dive.
It's a complex topic.
It's made me think a lot about my own food choices and how they connect to this global system.
It's always evolving, so staying informed is important.
For sure. Well, that brings us to the final part of our deep dive. We'll be exploring what all of this means for you as an individual listener and how you can navigate this system to make healthy and informed choices about the food you eat. So we've talked a lot about the big picture of trade and nutrition.
The global systems, the policies, all of that.
But now it's time to get personal, right? What does all of this mean for you, the listener? How can we use this information to make better choices?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that knowledge is power. When you understand how trade shapes the food you eat, you can start to make more conscious choices.
It's not just about grabbing whatever's on sale at the supermarket anymore.
Right, you can think about where that food came from, how it was produced, what's in it, and that can really change your habits.
Okay, so let's break it down. What are some concrete things listeners can do to put this into practice?
Well, first things first, read those labels.
Those nutrition labels, we talk about them all the time.
But they really are your best friend when it comes to making informed decisions. Take a look at the sugar, the fat, the sodium before you buy something.
And don't be fooled by all the marketing hype, right? Sometimes those labels can be a bit tricky.
Exactly. Those buzzwords like natural or healthy don't always tell the whole story.
So a little bit of skepticism goes a long way.
It does. Another important step is to prioritize fresh, whole foods whenever you can.
Those fruits, vegetables, whole grains, all the good stuff.
They might not always be the cheapest or the most convenient, but they're the foundation of a healthy diet.
And don't underestimate the power of cooking at home.
Absolutely. When you cook your own meals, you control what goes into them.
You know exactly what you're eating.
It can be fun, it can be creative, and it can be a really great way to explore new flavors.
And, if you do opt for processed foods, try to choose the ones that are minimally processed.
Right. Maybe instead of a bag of chips, you grab a handful of nuts or seeds.
It's about making those small changes that can have a big impact over time.
Little by little, you can really shift your eating habits.
So far, we've mostly talked about individual choices, but, we're also part of a larger system.
Right. Those individual choices matter, but they're influenced by the policies and the food environment around us.
So what can listeners do to support policies that encourage healthier diets?
Well, I think the first step is to stay informed. Pay attention to the conversations happening about trade agreements, about agricultural subsidies, about nutrition labeling laws.
Because those decisions directly impact what we eat and what's available to us.
And then, once you're informed, don't be afraid to speak up. Contact your elected officials, go to town hall meetings, support organizations that are working on these issues.
Find your voice heard.
You have a voice in shaping these policies.
And speaking of shaping things, we were talking before about this trend towards globalization of diets.
That homogenization of food cultures.
Right. So what can listeners do to celebrate the diversity of food cultures and make healthy choices at the same time?
One of the best things you can do is to just explore. Try different culinary traditions, step outside your comfort zone.
It's a fun way to expand your palate and connect with other cultures.
And when you travel, make a point of seeking out the local cuisine.
It's a great way to support those communities and experience something new.
And, of course, you can always experiment with cooking at home. Try new ingredients, new recipes, new flavors.
It's about finding that balance between embracing the richness of the food world and making choices that are good for you.
I think that's a great way to put it.
Well, this has been a really fascinating deep dive.
I've enjoyed talking about it.
We've covered a lot of ground, from global systems down to individual choices.
Yeah.
And hopefully we've given you some food for thought.
Pun intended.
Remember, every choice you make, whether it's at the grocery store or at the ballot box, can make a difference.
Thanks for joining us.
And until next time, happy exploring.